Hello, everyone. Today we will learn English through the story of Abraham Lincoln, a man who began life in a poor log cabin and later became the leader who helped save the Union. And as you listen, keep this question in your mind. How can a person with very little education, very little money, and many losses still build a life that changes a nation? Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12th, 1809, in Kentucky, in a small log cabin, and his early world was shaped by hard work, simple tools, and constant uncertainty. His family did not have comfort and they did not have stable land for long, so he learned early that survival depends on effort and patience. When he was a boy, the family moved into Indiana, where the forest was thick and the work was heavy, and daily life required cutting trees, building shelter, and protecting food supplies. Schooling existed only in short periods, and sometimes not at all. And if you imagine how difficult it is to learn when classes are rare and books are scarce, you can understand why Lincoln's later success was not the result of easy opportunity. Yet he developed a habit that became his quiet advantage. He treated learning as something he could do anywhere. He borrowed books whenever he could, reread them many times, and practiced writing so his thoughts could become organized and clear. He did not study because it was fashionable. He studied because he felt that reading could open a door that poverty kept closed. Then, when he was only 9, his mother died, and the loss cut deeply into his childhood. On the frontier, grief did not stop work, so he learned a hard lesson that many people face later in life. Pain can exist beside responsibility, and you still have to keep moving. Later, his father remarried, and his stepmother encouraged his reading, which mattered because one supportive voice can protect a young person's hope. Lincoln grew tall and strong, and he did difficult labor, including farm work and splitting rails. Yet inside he was training a different kind of strength, the ability to think before speaking, to listen without rushing, and to keep his temper under control. If you have ever felt stuck by your environment, consider what he did. He did not wait for perfect conditions because perfect conditions never arrived. Instead, he improved his skills step by step until he could create better conditions for himself. In 1830, the family moved again, this time to Illinois, and once more they had to start from the beginning. But Illinois also brought him closer to communities where trade and conversation were more active, and he began to imagine a life beyond the farm. He took practical jobs to earn money and build experience, and during his early adulthood he traveled by flatboat down major rivers, which exposed him to a wider world than the frontier. On those journeys he saw busy towns, commercial activity, and also the harsh reality of slavery in southern areas. And even if he did not yet know what role he would play, these scenes stayed with him, because once you see human beings treated as property, it is hard to forget. After he settled in New Salem, Illinois, he found a place where people could notice his character. He worked in a store, handled accounts, and spoke with customers, and through these ordinary duties he learned practical responsibility. He became known for honesty, not as a simple label, but as a daily habit, because he tried to return what did not belong to him, keep his promises, and be fair in small matters. And over time, those small choices built a reputation that made people trust him. He also joined the local militia during the Black Hawk War in 1832 and was elected captain by the men around him, which showed that even early in life he had an ability to earn respect through calm behavior. He was not a famous soldier, and he did not build his future on military glory, but he learned how quickly fear can spread and how much people need steady leadership when they feel uncertain. In the same year, he ran for the Illinois legislature and lost, and this failure could have ended his political ambition, especially because he did not have wealth or a powerful family name. But he treated the loss as information, not as a final judgment. He continued to work, continued to read, and continued to practice speaking because he understood that politics is not only about ambition, it is also about communication and trust. Soon after, he began studying the law on his own, reading legal texts and teaching himself how to reason in a disciplined way. This was not quick progress because self study requires patience and it requires the ability to continue even when no one is watching. Yet that is exactly why it mattered. He was building a professional future through personal discipline, not through social privilege. In 1834, he ran again for the legislature and won, starting a longer period of public service in Illinois. As a legislator, he supported development projects like roads and transportation because he believed that economic growth could improve ordinary lives, but he also learned how government really works, with negotiation, disagreement, and compromise. He began to see that a stable society depends on respect for law, and that when people replace law with anger or violence, the weakest people suffer most. At the same time, he carried a moral discomfort with slavery, and he began to understand that the nation's future would be shaped by how it handled that issue. His early life did not make him perfect, but it built something more useful than perfection. It built resilience. He experienced poverty, limited schooling, physical labor, personal loss, and public failure, yet he kept improving himself through reading, honest work, and careful communication. So here is the hook that should pull you into the next part. When a person starts with so little and still chooses discipline over excuses, what kind of future becomes possible? And what happens when that person steps onto a larger stage where every decision affects millions? After Abraham Lincoln gained experience in the Illinois legislature, he understood that success required more than hard work. It required skill, clear thinking, and the ability to deal with conflict without losing control. He moved to Springfield, Illinois, and built a serious legal career, and his work as a lawyer became one of the most important training grounds of his life. On the court circuit, he traveled from town to town, often under uncomfortable conditions, and he handled cases that involved debt, contracts, property, and personal disputes. These were not glamorous problems, but they taught him how ordinary people live, what they fear, and what they need from government and law. In court, he learned to simplify complex issues into clear steps, because juries and judges respond to logic, not confusion. He learned to persuade without insulting, and he learned that preparation is a form of respect, because when you are prepared, you waste less time and you make fewer mistakes. He also became known for honesty, and this reputation helped him because in both law and politics, trust is often the most valuable currency. At the same time, he struggled with deep sadness at certain periods, and people around him noticed what later observers called melancholy. Yet he continued his responsibilities, which shows a practical lesson. You do not need perfect emotions to act responsibly, and you do not need constant confidence to keep moving forward. Over time, his legal career improved his communication style. He preferred simple words, direct logic, and calm tone, and these habits later helped him speak to a nation divided by anger. He also developed a strong belief that respect for law matters, because without law, society becomes unsafe. In 1838, in Springfield, he warned that mob violence and disorder could destroy the country from inside, and he argued that even when laws need change, change should happen through legal institutions rather than through revenge. This did not mean he believed every law was just, but he believed that stability is necessary for real progress. During these years, his ideas about slavery also became more serious. He believed slavery was wrong, yet he understood that it was protected in states where it already existed, and he understood that quick change would be politically difficult. So he focused strongly on opposing slavery's expansion into new territories, because he believed that if slavery kept expanding, it would become harder and harder to end. In 1846, he won a seat in the United States House of Representatives and traveled to Washington, stepping onto a national stage. His term began during the Mexican American War, and he questioned the government's claims about where the fighting started, insisting on precise facts. This was controversial because many people wanted simple agreement, yet Lincoln believed that loyalty does not require silence, and that leaders must be honest, especially during war. He supported some gradual measures that would restrict slavery in certain areas, but after one term he returned to Illinois and focused again on law. For a time it seemed possible that his political story might end there. However, the nation was changing fast, and the problem of slavery became more dangerous with every new territory and every new law. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed settlers in those territories to vote on slavery, and it also canceled earlier restrictions that had limited slavery's spread. To Lincoln, this was a serious warning because it suggested that slavery could expand again into places where many had expected it to stop. He returned to politics with renewed energy, giving speeches that were careful but firm, and he argued that slavery should not be treated as a normal good that could grow without limits. He did not speak with hatred but with logic, and he tried to make listeners feel the moral weight of the issue without pushing them into panic. Then, in 1857, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision ruled that Black Americans could not be citizens and limited Congress's power to restrict slavery in the territories. Lincoln respected the court as an institution, but he warned that if citizens accepted the decision as a permanent rule without debate, then democracy would lose its meaning because public discussion would become useless. He argued that legal institutions matter, but citizens also matter, and citizens can work through politics to change laws and direction over time. His national reputation grew even more during the 1858 campaign for the U.S. Senate. In that campaign, he faced public debates that forced him to explain his views clearly under pressure. He argued that the nation could not remain half slave and half free forever, because deep contradictions do not stay stable. This famous idea was not a prediction of immediate disaster, but a warning that the country had to choose a clearer direction sooner or later. He did not win the Senate seat, but the debate spread his words across the nation, and many Americans began to see him as a leader who could speak about crisis without losing self-control. This is a powerful lesson about influence. Sometimes you do not win the position, but you win attention for your ideas, and attention can become the foundation of future responsibility. In 1860, he spoke at Cooper Union in New York City, and he prepared carefully, using historical evidence to argue that the nation's founders had opposed slavery's expansion. His speech was calm and strong, and it made him look like a serious national candidate rather than only a local politician. Later that year, he won the Republican nomination and then the presidency. His victory caused fear in the South, and several Southern states chose to leave the Union rather than accept his leadership. Between his election and inauguration in March 1861, he faced an almost impossible situation. If he promised too much, he would weaken his principles. If he promised too little, he would not calm fear. He spoke cautiously, hoping to prevent violence, but the division had already grown deep. After he entered office, the crisis became open conflict, and fighting began at Fort Sumter. Lincoln then faced a defining decision. Should the Union be allowed to break apart, or should it be defended? He chose to defend it, believing that if the Union could be destroyed by force, then the idea of a government chosen by the people would be threatened. The next part follows Lincoln through the brutal years of the Civil War, including his hardest decisions, his greatest moral turning point, and the reason he became a symbol of national purpose. When Abraham Lincoln became president in 1861, he stepped into the most dangerous situation the United States had ever faced because the Union was breaking apart and violence was already near. He did not have the luxury of slow learning, yet he still needed careful thinking, because one careless decision could push more states into rebellion or destroy public confidence. The first months of war were full of urgent problems. Protecting Washington, securing transportation and supply lines, keeping border regions loyal, and building an army large enough to fight a long conflict. Volunteers arrived with courage but limited training, and early battles quickly destroyed the idea that the war would be short. Lincoln spent countless hours reading reports and meeting commanders, and he tried to understand strategy, not because he enjoyed controlling everything, but because he believed that a leader cannot act as if war is someone else's responsibility. Yet military problems were only one part of his challenge. The political situation inside the Union was also unstable, because some loyal states still allowed slavery, and Lincoln feared that pushing too hard too fast might drive them away. So he balanced firmness with restraint, believing that the Union had to survive first if any long-term moral progress was going to be possible. Still, as the war continued, it became clear that slavery was not separate from the conflict. Slavery supported the Southern economy and labor system, and it shaped the rebellion's resources. Lincoln understood that if slavery remained strong, the rebellion could remain strong, and if the Union won without addressing slavery, the nation's core contradiction would remain. Yet he also understood that a president must act within legal limits, so he searched for a path that was both morally serious and legally defensible. He thought like a lawyer, weighing authority, timing, and consequences. During this period, he also experienced deep personal grief. In 1862, his son Willie died in the White House, and Lincoln's sadness became heavier while his national duties became more demanding. Many leaders collapse under this kind of double pressure, but Lincoln continued working, and his endurance shows a difficult lesson. Responsibility does not always pause when you are in pain, and sometimes the only way through sorrow is to keep moving with discipline. In 1862, as the war's cost became clearer, Lincoln moved toward a decision that would change the meaning of the conflict. He began to believe that the Union would not be fully saved if slavery remained protected. And he also believed that, as commander-in-chief during a rebellion, he could use wartime powers to weaken the enemy. This reasoning became the foundation for emancipation as a war measure. Still, he waited for a moment when the Union could act from strength rather than desperation, because he feared that issuing a major proclamation after a clear defeat would look like panic and would fail to persuade important audiences. After the Battle of Antietam in September 1862 stopped a Confederate advance into the North, he took that moment and issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, announcing that if the rebelling states did not return to the Union by January 1st, 1863, then enslaved people in areas still in rebellion would be declared free. When the final Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1st, 1863, it did not end slavery everywhere at once because it applied to rebellious areas rather than loyal slave states, but it transformed the war's purpose and made freedom central to Union victory. It also strengthened the Union's moral position and allowed more Black Americans to serve in the Union military, adding both manpower and meaning to the fight. Once Lincoln connected the war to a moral promise, the pressure on him increased because he could not retreat without damaging the nation's trust and future. Critics attacked him from both sides, some demanding faster change, others demanding that he stop, and he had to lead while standing in the middle of loud conflict. Through 1863, the war remained brutal, and Lincoln faced constant reports of casualties, political complaints, and public exhaustion. He also had to replace commanders who could not produce results because patience with failure in war can destroy a nation. Yet he kept returning to the core idea that the Union must survive, because if the Union could be broken by force, then democratic government would become fragile. In July 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg became a major turning point, with enormous losses and a Union success that helped stop another Confederate invasion of the North. Even though the victory mattered, the scale of death reminded everyone that the war was a severe test of endurance. Later that year, at the dedication of a cemetery on the Gettysburg battlefield, Lincoln delivered a short speech that became famous because it was clear and morally focused. In the Gettysburg Address, he reminded Americans that the nation was founded on an idea of equality, that the dead had sacrificed for a cause larger than themselves, and that the living had a duty to continue the work so the nation could experience a new birth of freedom. He did not boast, and he did not treat war as glorious. Instead, he framed the struggle as a test of whether a free government could survive, and his simplicity made the message stronger. This moment teaches a valuable communication lesson. When a situation is serious, clear language and logical structure can influence people more than emotional noise. By the end of 1863, Lincoln had become a man shaped by grief, criticism, and pressure. Yet he did not become cruel or careless. He maintained restraint because he believed that anger can destroy judgment. The war was now moving toward its final stage, but the hardest political test was still ahead because Lincoln had to face an election while the country was still bleeding. If he lost, the war's purpose could change, and the future of the Union and emancipation could become uncertain. The next part follows him through 1864 and early 1865, when he fought for victory, fought for lasting freedom and law, and prepared to rebuild a nation that had nearly destroyed itself. As 1864 began, Abraham Lincoln faced a harsh reality. The war was still not finished, and the country was tired of sacrifice. Many families had already lost sons and fathers, prices and stress were rising, and some citizens questioned whether the Union could afford to continue. Lincoln knew that public support can collapse when people stop believing in progress, so he looked for a strategy that matched his own character. Steady pressure, steady effort, and a refusal to quit simply because the road was painful. He supported commanders who would keep constant pressure on Confederate forces rather than chase only dramatic victories, and this approach produced hard fighting and heavy casualties. Each report forced Lincoln to confront the moral weight of leadership, because even when the goal is just, every death is still a human tragedy. He read dispatches late into the night, met with officials and military leaders, and tried to see the war as it really was, not as people wished it to be. At the same time, he faced the election of 1864. This election was not only about his career, it was about the direction of the war and the meaning of Union victory. Some voices demanded negotiation even if it meant separation or the survival of slavery. Others demanded faster change and harsher punishment. Lincoln had to decide what kind of peace was acceptable, and he concluded that a peace that broke the Union or protected slavery as a permanent right would not be true peace, it would be surrender. He also understood that he might lose the election, and he prepared himself for that possibility with duty rather than fear. He believed that even if he were defeated politically, he still had an obligation to use his remaining time in office to protect the Union's future as much as possible. This is a key lesson about integrity. Doing what is right should not depend on personal victory. During the summer of 1864, military progress seemed slow, and Lincoln privately expected defeat at times, yet he did not collapse. He continued to support the war effort, continued to keep the government functioning, and continued to hold the Union together through careful communication. Then, as military successes improved later in the year, public confidence increased, and in November 1864, he won re-election. Lincoln did not treat the result as personal praise. He treated it as a signal that many Americans still accepted the cost of preserving the Union and moving toward freedom. After the election, he focused on making freedom permanent. The Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime act, and Lincoln understood that wartime authority could be challenged after peace returned. He wanted a stronger foundation, so he supported a constitutional amendment that would abolish slavery everywhere in the United States. He worked to persuade lawmakers using political skill and careful reasoning because he believed that if slavery remained legally protected, the country could not rebuild on honest principles. When Congress approved what became the 13th Amendment in early 1865, it marked a decisive legal end to slavery, at least on paper, and it made clear that the nation's future would not be built on human ownership. Lincoln also began focusing more intensely on Reconstruction, the process of restoring the southern states to the Union and rebuilding national unity. His instinct was to combine firmness and reconciliation. He wanted the rebellious states to accept the authority of the national government and the end of slavery, but he also believed that revenge would create long-term instability. He spoke about reunion in a way that aimed to reduce hatred because he understood that after a civil war, people must live together again, share courts, markets, and political power. And if anger stays in control, peace becomes fragile. In March 1865, during his second inauguration, he spoke in a tone that revealed how deeply the war had shaped him. He did not celebrate victory because the war was not fully finished and because the cost had been enormous. He reflected on suffering and responsibility, and he urged Americans to act with firmness in what was right and charity toward all. His words suggested that he saw the war as a moral reckoning, as well as a political conflict, and he understood that healing would require humility. In April 1865, the Confederacy's main forces surrendered, and the Union achieved the victory Lincoln had fought for. Yet Lincoln knew that victory did not solve every problem. The nation now faced difficult questions about civil rights, economic rebuilding, political trust, and the protection of newly freed people. He wanted the country to move forward with law, stability, and moral purpose. Then, at the moment when many believed his greatest work was about to begin, his life ended suddenly. On the evening of April 14, 1865, he attended a public performance in Washington and was attacked and fatally wounded. He died early the next morning, April 15, 1865, and the country reacted with shock and grief because the leader who had carried the Union through its darkest crisis was gone when peace was just beginning. Lincoln's story remains powerful because it is not only about a tragic ending, it is about a disciplined life. He started in poverty with limited schooling, and he built skill through reading, practice, and honest work. He experienced loss and failure, yet he kept improving, showing that progress is often the result of consistent habits rather than sudden luck. He used language carefully, spoke with logic, and avoided unnecessary cruelty, even under pressure. And when the nation faced its greatest test, He chose long-term national survival over short-term comfort. The final lesson is direct and practical. You do not need to control the entire future to improve your life. You only need to control the next responsible action repeated day after day, because over time those actions build character, and character allows you to carry greater responsibility. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed learning English through stories and gained some new knowledge, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If there's any character you'd like me to create a story about, from any country, just comment below and I'll make it for you. Turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next English story. Keep learning, keep growing. See you in the next video.